It is the middle of the night in Boston, and the city has gone quiet. The bars emptied hours ago. The parades, the crowds, the long St. Patrick's Day that this city takes more seriously than almost any other, all of it is over. The streets are wet and empty. It is the early morning of March 18th, 1990. On a narrow side street called Palace Road, a single light burns above a doorway. Behind it stands one of the most extraordinary buildings in America, a Venetian palace transplanted to New England, its galleries hung with 4 centuries of masterpieces. Inside it, tonight, 2 young men are working the overnight watch. One of them is 23 years old, a musician, working the night shift to pay his bills. His job is to walk the rounds, watch the dark, and wait for morning. Then, at 24 minutes past 1, the buzzer rings. Outside, in the cold, stand 2 men in the uniforms of the Boston police. There has been a disturbance in the neighborhood, they say. They need to come inside. He knows the most important rule of the night watch. After hours, the door stays closed, not for anyone. His hand moves toward the buzzer. In the 81 minutes that follow, the largest unsolved art heist in history will unfold on the other side of that door. And more than 3 decades later, no one will have answered for it. To understand what was stolen that night, you first have to understand the woman who built the place it was stolen from. Isabella Stewart Gardner did not behave the way Boston expected a woman of her wealth to behave. Born in New York in 1840, married into a prominent Boston family, she spent her life ignoring the city's narrow rules. She traveled the world. She kept company with artists and scholars. And over several decades, with a sharp eye and a considerable fortune, she assembled one of the greatest private art collections in America. She did not want it locked in a vault or broken apart and sold after her death. She wanted it kept whole, and she wanted it seen. So she built it a home. She called it Fenway Court. From the outside, a plain brick building on the edge of a Boston marsh. But step through its doors, and you entered a 15th century Venetian palace. Galleries built around a soaring, glass-roofed courtyard, full of flowering plants in the dead of a New England winter. Every painting, every sculpture, every chair and tapestry placed in deliberate conversation with everything around it. This was not simply a building that held art. The building itself was the art. It opened to the public in 1903, and when Isabella Gardner died in 1924, she left behind a will with one extraordinary condition. The collection was never to change. Nothing could be added. Nothing could be moved. If the museum ever rearranged what she had created, the entire collection could be sold, and every dollar handed to Harvard. She had built something she meant to last, exactly as it was, forever. By the spring of 1990, the Gardner Museum had stood for almost 90 years. Its overnight security had settled into a quiet, uneventful routine, the kind of job where, most nights, nothing happens at all. On the night of March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, 2 guards were on duty. One was a 23-year-old named Richard Abeth. Most people called him Rick. Abeth was not a career security guard. He was a musician, working the overnight shift the way many young people work jobs that pay the rent while the rest of a life takes shape. And he had recently handed in his 2 weeks' notice. The night of the 17th was one of his last shifts. The work was simple. The guards walked their rounds through the silent galleries. They watched the monitors, and they relied on the museum's security systems. Among them, a network of motion detectors installed quietly throughout the building that recorded every footstep on every floor onto a hard drive. Where a person walked and when, the system remembered. And at the security desk, near the side entrance, there was one more thing, a panic button. Press it, and an alarm would call the Boston police directly to the museum's door. That button was the most important object in the building that night. Everything that was about to happen would turn on a single question, whether anyone could reach it. Rick Abeth pressed the buzzer. The 2 policemen stepped in out of the cold. Calm, unhurried, entirely ordinary. 2 officers on a routine call in the middle of a quiet night. They told Abeth they were investigating a disturbance and needed to look around. Then, one of them did something strange. He studied Abeth's face and said the young guard looked familiar. There was a warrant out for someone, he said. Abeth should step out from behind the desk. It was a small request, delivered casually, and Abeth complied. It was also the entire heist, because the desk Abeth was stepping away from held the only thing in the building that could save him, the single button that would call the real Boston police. The moment he walked away from it, he stopped being a guard. He was just a young man in an empty museum, doing what 2 men in uniform told him to do. They asked him to summon the second guard. He did. And when the second man came down, the officers produced no citations and asked no further questions. They produced handcuffs. This was not an arrest. One of the men said so plainly. This was a robbery. Cooperate and no one would be hurt. The guards' hands were cuffed behind their backs, their eyes and mouths wrapped with duct tape. And the two men who had walked in dressed as police officers led them downward, away from the galleries, into the basement. It was not yet 1:30 in the morning. The thieves now had the Gardner Museum entirely to themselves. 81 minutes. That was how long they would stay. The basement of the Gardner Museum is a different world from the galleries above. No marble, no gilded frames, no soft Venetian light. Only pipes and concrete and the low mechanical hum of the building. The two guards were brought down and separated, handcuffed to pipes on opposite sides of the basement, far enough apart that they could not see one another, could not speak, could not even be certain the other man was still there. For them, the next several hours passed in complete darkness. Tape across their eyes, tape across their mouths, the cold of the floor and the sound of the building, and nothing else. They did not know how many intruders were inside the museum. They did not know what those intruders were doing. They did not know whether they would be left alive. And above their heads, in the silent galleries, the largest art theft in history was already underway, while the two people closest to it in all the world could only lie in the dark and listen and wait. The thieves climbed to the second floor, to a gallery called the Dutch Room. It held the heart of the collection. Here, they worked. They took down two large Rembrandts, among them, Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee, the only seascape the Dutch master is known to have painted. And rather than carry the canvases away whole, in their frames, they cut them out, with a blade. They took a Vermeer, the Concert, one of only some 36 Vermeers known to survive anywhere on Earth. They took a landscape long believed to be Rembrandt's own work. They took a tiny Rembrandt self-portrait, an etching no larger than a postage stamp, from the side of a cabinet. And from a tabletop, they lifted an ancient Chinese beaker, cast in bronze more than 3,000 years ago. Then they moved to a second gallery, the Short Gallery, and went through cabinets that Isabella Gardner had designed herself, taking 5 works on paper by the French artist Edgar Degas. There, they paused to pry a bronze eagle from the top of a flagstaff, a finial that had once crowned a banner of Napoleon's Imperial Guard. Then they descended to the first floor, and from a room called the Blue Room, took one final painting, a small portrait of a man at a cafe table by the French master Edouard Manet. 13 works in all. They carried them out to a car waiting in the dark on Palace Road, in 2 separate trips. And at roughly 2:45 in the morning, they drove away. They did not know, could not have known, that for the entire 81 minutes, the museum had been watching. The motion detectors in its ceilings recorded their every step, writing each movement onto a hard drive, every room they entered, and every room they did not. Behind them, the gallery stood silent, the frames hanging empty and ragged where the canvases had been cut away. And in the basement, in the dark, the two guards were still waiting for morning. Morning came. The shift changed. And when the next guard arrived and found the security desk unattended, he searched the building and found the 2 night guards in the basement, still bound, still taped, exactly where the thieves had left them. The police were called. Then the FBI. And as investigators moved through the galleries, the scale of it began to settle over them. 13 works of art were gone. Their value, even by careful estimate, ran well past $500 million. There had never been an art theft like it anywhere in the world. There still has not been. But almost immediately, something about the crime did not sit right. Because for all the masterpieces the thieves had carried out, there was one they walked straight past. In the same museum, within easy reach, hung the painting by the Italian master Titian, The Rape of Europa. By most measures, the single most valuable work in the entire collection. The thieves did not touch it. They had cut 2 Rembrandts from their frames with a blade, a crude, damaging act, one that lowers a painting's worth the instant it is done. Something no serious handler of art would ever do. They had spent precious minutes of their 81 prying a decorative eagle off a flagpole, worth a tiny fraction of the paintings around it. They had taken sketches and left treasures. This was not how professional art thieves behave. Professionals steal in order to sell, and they protect what they steal. These men had moved through one of the greatest collections on Earth and made choices that, to anyone who understood that world, made no sense at all. Which raised a deeply uncomfortable question. If this crime was not really about the art, then what was it about? When the FBI examined the museum's security record, the data from those motion detectors, the silent log of every footstep taken inside the building that night, they found, at first, much of what they expected. The thieves' path through the Dutch room, their path through the short gallery, a clear trail of two intruders moving across the second floor. But there was one painting the data could not explain. The Manet, the small portrait taken from the first floor blue room, had been removed from a gallery the thieves, according to the censors, never set foot in. There was no record of either intruder entering that room, none at all. The only footsteps the motion detectors picked up in the blue room that night belonged to someone else. They belonged to Rick Abath, recorded earlier in the evening as he walked his ordinary rounds. And there was one more detail buried in that record, small, easy to miss. Some minutes before Abath buzzed the two men in police uniforms through the side door, he had briefly opened that same side door himself, once, for a reason investigators found suspicious, though Abath later said he was checking that the door was locked. Abath would insist, for the rest of his life, that he had done nothing wrong, that he was a victim of the heist, no different from the museum itself. But the museum's own security system had recorded a story with a gap in it. A gap shaped exactly like a question. Who took the Manet? And what was the open door for? If the men who robbed the Gardner Museum were not professional art thieves, the FBI needed to learn who they actually were. And the search, almost from the beginning, led away from the world of galleries and auction houses, into the criminal underworld of Boston. The prevailing theory was that this had been a local job, that the men inside the museum that night were not connoisseurs, but ordinary criminals, and that the art had been taken not to be admired, but to be used, as leverage, as a bargaining chip, the kind of thing a man facing a long prison sentence might trade for his freedom. Investigators kept circling back to the same orbit of figures. There was a Dorchester auto repair shop run by a mob associate named Carmelo Merlino, where men with criminal records came and went. Over the years, Merlino would boast to informants that he could lay his hands on the stolen paintings and claim the museum's reward. He never produced them. He was later caught in an FBI sting, convicted, and died in prison in 2005. The art still missing. There was Bobby Donati, tied to the powerful Patriarcha crime family, known to have studied the museum, and who, a jeweler later claimed, had shown him what appeared to be the stolen Napoleonic eagle and asked what it might be worth. In 1991, Donati was murdered, found stabbed, in the trunk of a car. And Donati was not alone. In the years after the heist, a striking number of the men whose names surfaced in the investigation met violent or sudden ends, shot or killed or simply dead before anyone could ever make them talk. In 2013, the FBI announced that it believed it finally knew who the two thieves were, the men who had walked through that side door. The Bureau also believed both of them were already dead, and for the time being, it declined to say their names out loud. The years passed. The investigation never closed, but it never broke open either. And as time went on, the law itself began to work against any hope of justice. In the United States, the crime of theft carries a statute of limitations, a deadline past which no one can be charged at all. For the Gardner heist, that deadline ran out, which means that today, the simple fact is this: even if the two men who walked through that door were somehow still alive, even if they could be found and named and proven guilty beyond any doubt, they could no longer be prosecuted for stealing the art. The clock had run out on the crime itself. The museum and federal prosecutors understood what that meant, and so they made the most pragmatic offer they could. They were no longer chasing a conviction, they wanted the art. To anyone who had it or knew where it was, they extended a remarkable promise: immunity from prosecution, complete confidentiality. Hand back the paintings and you would not be charged, and your name would never be spoken. They went further. The reward the museum offered for the safe return of the works was raised over the years to $10 million, the largest reward ever posted by a private institution. Consider what that means. Every reason a person might have not to return the art had been stripped away. No prison, no exposure, no risk, and a fortune waiting for whoever picked up the phone. And still, nothing. No paintings, no call. Only silence, year after year, while the men who were said to know the truth grew old and died, one after another, without ever once sitting in a courtroom. For one man, the case never let go. Jeffrey Kelly spent more than 2 decades of his FBI career working the Gardner heist, following its leads, interviewing its suspects, watching them die before they could be made to answer. And in 2026, after he had retired, Kelly did something the Bureau itself never had. He wrote it all down and laid out the conclusion he had reached. In Kelly's account, the central mystery, who actually robbed the museum, is, in essence, solved. He believes the heist was carried out by a crew of local Boston criminals. He names the 2 men he is convinced walked through the side door that night: George Reisfelder and Leonard DiMuzio, petty criminals both, and both, tellingly, dead within roughly a year of the theft. And he believes the thieves did not get past the guard by luck. He believes Rick Abath let them in, knowing exactly what he was doing. It is a powerful account, told by the man who knew the case better than almost anyone alive. But it is important to be precise about what it is. It is a theory, deeply informed, carefully argued, but not a verdict. No court has ever tested it. Officially, the case remains unsolved, and the people still searching have not given up. At the museum, a security director named Anthony Amore has spent 20 years of his own life trying to bring the paintings home. He fields a constant stream of tips, many from people falsely claiming to have the art, and he has a quiet way of exposing them. He asks them to describe the back of a painting. The fakes never can. When the paintings were torn from the walls of the Gardner Museum, they left behind their frames. For 4 years, the museum left the question of what to do with them unanswered. Then, in 1994, it made a decision. A deliberate, quiet, and quietly devastating one. It chose not to fill the gaps. It chose not to hide them. Instead, it cleaned the empty frames and hung them back on the walls, exactly where they had always been, surrounding nothing. Isabella Gardner had once written into her will that her collection must never change, that every object remained forever in the place she had chosen for it. She could never have imagined the form that promise would finally take. But the museum has kept it. The frames have stayed. And so, if you walk into the Dutch Room today, more than 36 years after that St. Patrick's night, you will find them still there. Great gilded frames, ornate and beautiful and empty, framing bare wall. They are not a sign of defeat. The museum has always insisted on that. They are a sign of waiting, a space held open, a place still set for 13 works of art somewhere out in the world tonight, and for the truth of what happened inside that museum, neither of which has ever come home.